I think I remember the first time we ever learned that song was really out of choir book rather than this blue book. And I've always liked that song ever since. I like that. We're every person on the earth a scribe. We're the sky a parchment. Wouldn't be enough room. That's why we ought to have our voices full of praise on Wednesday night when we come in here. If nothing else, to thank him, we're still alive. He hasn't killed us this week. Amen. Sometimes you think. Well, we're in the 22nd lesson of our series in Judges. We're back into it. We're back in dealing with Samson. And tonight we're in chapter 14, going to cover that. We covered chapter 13 before. We're looking at Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Just as a reminder, because it has been 3 weeks since we've been in the book of Judges. We ended our last study in chapter 13, and the final verse that was there, if you remember us going through, and this is the final judge in the list. But if you remember that, it says, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Now remember that there we were introduced to Manoah the father. We do not know Mom's name, but she seemed to be a very wise and spiritual woman. We were also introduced to the culture of Israel, which makes their worship and spirituality even more interesting and intense, because the culture of Israel at this time, they had fallen into the corruption of idolatry, and of course from that then they had become captives of the Philistines, and you'll see some of that tonight. Both of these parents were worshipers of Jehovah. Both agreed to raise up a new judge, a deliverer, chosen by God and given a Nazirite vow. She was, if you remember, a barren but blessed lady. And so we can determine from all of that and what we're going to see some tonight that Samson came from a godly family. They knew that their child was a chosen vessel of the Lord. And it began, just kind of, we see that he was blessed, and then periodically God used him, raised him up, and he did something, but we don't know what. But now all of a sudden in chapter 14, he's already a young man. In fact, he appears to be at the age that he had been ready to marry. Nothing is stated again about Manoah and his wife and their teaching of Samson, but we know that he was raised as a Nazirite. They had to have taught him that. I don't know how much they taught him, and nor do you. Maybe they left off something. Maybe they left off and didn't discipline enough. Sometimes you get the idea that Samson was this huge bulk of a man. But if he was, then it wouldn't have seemed special for him to have the strength that he did. I think he was a normal-looking character, and that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he did some mighty things. The information that we're going to look at tonight, and to understand something about the motivations and even the emotion of this story, is kind of salted throughout the whole chapter. But you have to look into it and pay attention to it. What we're going to see when we begin to look at this whole story, I thought I had my outline up there. I guess I don't. Maybe I've got it somewhere else. Well, if it comes up, it comes up. But you'll see the outline kind of with each verse. We're going to see him, first of all, having to do with the wrong place, being in the wrong place. Samson looked for a wife among the Philistines. He was more familiar with, it seems, or attracted to, the places of the Philistines rather than the places of his own people. And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman of Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. This is a city controlled by the Philistines. it led him to not only the wrong place, but the wrong people. A city controlled of the Philistines led him to the wrong people. A Philistine woman who we'll learn too, and he came up and told his father and mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife. Kind of strange when you see this. When we start looking at that, again, the Philistines, they're not the condemned Canaanites. They were more like the cousins of the Egyptians. But they were still idolaters, and they were foreigners, and the people of Israel seemed to be content to live under their rule. And it's a situation in which Samson was raised. He shouldn't have been comfortable with that. And it seems like maybe he wasn't. He knew there was something there. But with the wrong people and the wrong place, the focus was also on the wrong pleasure. Samson's eyes were pleased with this Philistine woman. But if you notice, let's read it. Then his father and his mother said to him, is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all my people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? That's a good question. But here's the problem. And Samson said unto his father, get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. His eyes were pleased. Samson's judgment pleased himself. You're going to see that, to me, when you start looking at this, he's got his taste buds first and foremost in the front. Now, with whatever failure we may see in Samson, you still need to remember that God's going to use Samson, not to raise an army, but to provoke the heathen and to begin to break their rule over Israel. Then we get into verse 4, in fact, verses 4 through 6. But his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord, that he sought an occasion against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Before I go any further, this is where the Lord, and where a lot of people get some haywire ideas. His father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord. Did he wanted to go marry a Philistine? Well, the Lord is in charge of everything. And the Lord's going to work this out to his end and to his purpose. It doesn't mean that God was all for Samson breaking and violating the rules of the law or the violating God's word. You have to remember that all things work together for good. It doesn't say all things are good, but all things work together for good to them who love God and are called according to his purpose. And I hate to see what happens to a lot of translations that change the structure and the construction of that verse, and they change the whole meaning of it. It's important to understand what that verse says. Even in the Greek, it's stronger than even in our English language. But it's the point that here, when we're looking at this, let me get down because I've got some notes that I passed by because of having them on my outline. But I want to see this is not a sanctioning by God of his choice of marriage. It is that God would use this connection with the Philistines to begin the deliverance from the hands of the Philistines. Now, notice this too, what it says. Not that they didn't know that it was of the Lord, that he sought an occasion against the Philistines. Well, who's the he? Don't be so quick. Because it could be, and most people will say in the structure, that he is either Samson or it's God. Those are the only two choices you got. If we give it to Samson, then we see him having a motive beyond the pleasure of his eyes. In other words, what we see, because again, he is seeing that, he's just using this whole thing, that he really has no desire to really marry. Yes, he does. He has a desire to marry this woman. But he also is being moved by the Lord. But I believe it is the Lord who is going to construct some things. We can't use this to justify wrong actions just because God will use them later for his glory to make our decisions sound wise. Well, God worked it out. So my sin really wasn't too bad. Your sin is still sin. Look, if you want to argue about that, go to Acts 2. And it says that God, in his counsel, and meaning this is from his eternal counsel, predetermined that those men would crucify the Lord Jesus Christ on Calvary. But he says, you men who did this with wicked hands, it doesn't alleviate them from their culpability or their responsibility. God just overruled. God did it and will use it to his glory. One commentator, in fact, many commentators give Samson the motive of being moved by the Spirit as an excuse to agitate them. One commentator, in fact, said God makes the folly of man to contribute finally to the fulfillment of his purpose. And I would agree with that. That's the right idea. That again, God will use. How many mistakes have you made in your life? And God didn't just dispense with you. But in fact, God used that error, that mistake, that sin to cause you to grow and to prosper later. It doesn't excuse the sin. So you got to think a little bit more like that. Again, God makes the folly of man to contribute finally to the fulfillment of his purpose. Then verse 5. Then Samson down. Again, here we're going to see the Lord's protection, verses 5 and 6. Then went Samson down and his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. Now, we got all these things going on in this one verse, but then Samson went down with his father and mother, but apparently they separated somewhere, or he said, Mom and Dad, you go on, and he wanted to take a little detour because they're not with him when he kills the lion. And when this young lion roars, in fact, where's he at when he does that? He came to the vineyards of Timnath. This is also in the wrong place. Vineyards were grapes. Grapes were something that they made wine from and alcohol. So this was something, even the grape, even a raisin, was restricted from his diet. He had no business going into the vineyard. And when he goes into the vineyard, what does he find? A roaring lion. Can we possibly think of comparing any spiritual application when we get out of the right way, when we get away from where we should be, that we're probably going to run into a roaring lion who tries to devour us? There's some lessons in here. We ought to make sure that we make no provision for the flesh. Samson shouldn't have taken that detour, but he did. And the young lion roared against him. That's why I said this is the Lord's protection. What did he do? He was just able to take. Let's look. Verse 6. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, small sheep or goat, and he had nothing in his hand. But he told not his father or his mother what he had done. So they weren't there, and he didn't even bother telling them. Now, some people will say, well, he didn't tell them because he was violating the Nazirite vow because he had touched now a dead corpse. Well, he didn't touch it until he killed it. But I think it's more the fact that he was probably over there maybe sneaking some grapes. I don't know. I have no idea. We don't know. But apparently, again, this lion roared against him, but not them. The young lion is not a whelp. It's not a baby. It is a fully mature, but it's still a young lion. But when it says it's young, it's full of strength. But God protected him. God had given a divine mandate to Samson that he was going to be a deliverer. he was going to begin to deliver, and he has not really done too much up to this particular point. So it protected him because of what should take place. The Spirit of the Lord came mightily, powerfully upon him. But while he was victorious over the lion, he continued on in this path to marry an idolater. It's interesting. There's no call from Samson to the Lord to protect him. No call from Samson to be strengthened by the Lord. But he did protect Samson. The only time, in fact, you will find Samson calling for God to give him that strength is at the end of his life and the final action of his life. But again, I can't help but compare this to the devil, who as a roaring lion seeks to devour us. But with the might and strength of the Spirit, we too can easily destroy that roaring lion. Verse 17, and he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. From verse 7 and verse 9, I call this Samson's sinful proximity. By that I mean, like a lot of Christians, Samson tried to get as close to sin as he could without sinning. You know, serious, there's a lot of Christians who want to get as close to the line without, how far can I get past? Is this a sin? Is that a sin? Okay, I'll stay back, but I'm going to get right up to the line. We grimace, but listen, there's a lot of Christians who do that. The arrangements have been made, and now Samson and the woman talk again, and he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. Again, pleasure. His proximity to pleasure is really his proximity to sin. He had not talked to this woman before, as far as we could tell. All he did was see her. I want to marry her. Isn't that odd? How'd you like that? Jackson all of a sudden said, that girl I want to marry. And that happens, doesn't it? So all you got to do is see him. That's the one I want to marry. If he did talk to her, we don't read about it. Had he seen her before? Was she the most beautiful woman that was there? Well, her father said no. Father says she's got a prettier sister. But there was something that hooked Samson. Don't know what it was. But Samson's pleasure was first and foremost. Notice verse 8, what he says, and after a time he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and beheld there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. I read that, emphasizing it on purpose. The honey was inside the carcass of the lion. You'll find readers that will say, oh, well, you know, he could have reached it without touching the carcass. Because the Nazarite was not supposed to touch a dead body. Nazarite, in fact, according to Numbers 6 and 6, was not even supposed to go near a dead body. Not even your mother, your father, your brother, or your sister. It's how strict it was. Doesn't matter what you think of it, that's the thing. Now, if you went near, then you are defiled. I think the carcass is mentioned because he would had to have touched. It doesn't say bones. A lot of people say, oh, we got in the bones. It says carcass. And in fact, carcass can talk about a living body as well. That word can. So we're still talking about a lion that's probably got meat and bones and everything else. And he saw it, and he saw the bees. And he went up there, opened it up, and reached in and grabbed that honeycomb out of there. In fact, several of them probably. And his hands are just dripping with honey, and he's eating it on the way. After a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees, that's what attracted him, and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands, and went on eating, and came to his father and mother, and gave them, and they did eat. But he told them not, or told not them, that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of a lion. I don't know why, but we're going to learn some more about it. But you got to think about this. Here he is barehanded, sticking his hands into a beehive. How many of you are going to do that? He's grabbing that comb. No mention of the stinging of the bees, nothing else. But don't get lost on all of this. But do get lost on the fact of this was a very interesting study. He gave to his parents. Now, was this defiling them too? Well, they didn't have to be worried about that anymore. She was only supposed to do that until the time he was born. They're not held under the Nazirite vows. There's no defilement for them. But I thought how interesting to see people talk and write about this defilement and what happened here. And all of a sudden I get to Mr. Spurgeon. And Spurgeon preached an entire and beautiful sermon encouraging others to feed your friends with the honey that's dripping off of your hands. He has a sermon, it's called Hands Full of Honey. It's number 1703. He compares it to Jesus as the conqueror of death, who destroyed the lion, the devil. And out of that battle, he bids us come and eat of the sweetness that he provides. Come share. We get to tell other people they can share in the joy dripping with sweetness. He preached a very simple outline, 3 points. Number 1, the believer's life has its conflicts. Number 2, the believer's life has its sweets. And number 3, the believer's life leads him to communicate those sweets to others. On a totally different perspective on reaching into that carcass and getting that honey. He said, the sum of what I want to say is this: if we have tasted any joy in Christ, if we have known any consolation of the Spirit, if faith has been to us a real power, and if it has wrought in us peace and rest, let us communicate this blessed discovery to others. If you do not do so, mark you will have missed the very object for which God has blessed you. In fact, then he tells a little story about an American teacher giving a lecture to his students. And he first of all begins to talk to them about a watch. What's a watch for? Tell time. Well, what if this watch doesn't work? What's it good for? Nothing. And he talks about a pocket knife and a pencil. A pocket knife. The kids say, well, it's good for whittling. What if it won't cut a thing? Well, that knife is good for nothing. How about the pencil? What's it for? To make a mark. But what if the pencil won't make a mark? What's it good for? Nothing. Then he asks the question, then what is the chief end of man? You all know, don't you? The chief end of man is to glorify God. Well, then if you don't do what you were built to do, then what good are you? Ooh, that's a stinging little question, isn't it? Huh. Samson did not tell his parents because he was holding it a secret. He was beginning maybe to understand how God would use him to deliver Israel from the Philistines. He had the Spirit moving upon him at times, but no notice of how or what is even mentioned. Samson appears to be either a quiet man or a secretive man, and I tend to think he was more secretive. Why the riddle? You will have as fun as many commentators do trying to figure that one out. Verse 10. So his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used the young men. Many have made notice of the word feast, which often includes a party, drinking even. But if you remember again, Samson was excluded from drinking any alcohol. Not even in moderation. And I don't know about you, I don't drink. I usually, even in my business, when I used to go out as a salesman, and I would take others out to lunch or to brunch or whatever I would take them to, I would tell them I don't buy alcohol. just so you know. Because a lot of salesmen, that's what they do. They spend a lot of money on alcohol. They turn their tabs in. I don't do that. I don't drink, and I don't buy somebody else alcohol. I can't imagine that Samson would do that, but that's what that feast was, possibly. Again, another failure. It would be best for us if we would be busy doing the same, not to be around temptation, not to involve ourselves in temptation. Samson, if he didn't sin in any of this, again, he got as close to it as he could to enjoy what he could and what he could see. Verse 11, it came to pass when they saw him that they brought him 30 companions to be with. I didn't say anything this while ago in verse 10, but this is the part of the corrupt partners that you're going to begin to see. These were not the companions of Jews that were coming from home. These were not his friends from the tribe of Dan. These were Philistines that he had made friends with in this area. I would say probably more of acquaintances than anything else, but they were even supplied by the Philistines. You know, again, who should be your primary friends? It doesn't mean you exclude other people. But a lot of times, even like with the choice that Samson made, his choice was based on his sight, not an investigation, not finding out whether or not their faith was compatible with one another. He made a choice based on not spiritual aptitude at all, not spiritual compatibility. And here we see 30 companions, and it's going to be more about this in a little bit, but they became his companions, or his wedding party, if you will. Verse 12, and Samson said to them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you. Now, we've all read this riddle probably, and you know the riddle, and because you already know what happened in the story, you know the answer to the riddle. So there's no confusion. There's no cryptic message that's here. He says, I'll put forth a riddle unto you if you can certainly declare it me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out. Here's the problem. The riddle is not the problem. He throws a wager into the mix. He gambles. That's what he's doing. Now, he's certain and sure they're not going to be able to guess his riddle. That's why he did it. He's got a sure thing going. But I'm going to tell you, he brought this wager in, or a bet, and it was setting something in motion that brought out the evil in those companions. Here again, he says, if you can declare it within 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 sheets and 30 change of garments. Verse 13, but if you cannot declare it me, then shall you give me 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. And they sent it and put forth thy riddle, that we may hear it. So they agreed. And he said unto them, out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not in 3 days expound the riddle. Now we get to the pouty pretender. That's her, his wife, if you will. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they said unto Samson's wife, entice thy husband that he may declare unto us the riddle. Now, that would have been fine just to stop there, but they didn't stop there. Look how despicable they got. You do that, or we're going to burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Have ye called us to take that we have? Is it not so? In other words, we're going to lose everything. You need to make sure and do this for us. And Samson's wife, this is why I call her the pouty partner. Samson's wife wept before him and said, thou dost hate me and lovest me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle unto the children of my people, and you haven't told it to me. He says, no big deal, hon. I haven't even told my mom or my dad. Shall I tell it to you? I don't want anybody to know this. That's why, again, he didn't tell his mom or dad anything about the lion that he had killed. But here we go again. And she wept before him the 7 days, the whole time, while their feast lasted. And it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him. That means she pressured him. That word there is compressed, oppressed, distressed. She's crying and tears, and he can't handle it. And so he told her, and she told the riddle to the children of her people. I think Samson's beginning to change his mind about this woman. He's finding something out about her. Can you imagine every day crying, tears, and weeping? I mean, it would wear on you for 7 days. Aimed at you, you don't love me. Verse 18, Samson's anger provoked. And the men of the city said unto him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion? He looked at them and he knew right off the bat. He said unto them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you had not found out my riddle. Woo! Plowed with my heifer. Hi, Mom, you're a cow. You like that? That's not very nice, is it? Well, he wasn't saying it to her. He was saying it to them, and the picture was very clear. If you hadn't used my wife to plow that field up, you'd have never found out anything. It communicated exactly the mind and the perception of Samson. And he is using a language that's very clearly calling them cheaters. It might be a little slight on her too. But Samson has lost the wager. He could have said, you won, but you cheated. But he didn't. He's angry. But here's where the purpose of the Lord comes into play. Verse 19. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon. It's about 23 miles away. So I think he was taking a brisk walk to get this whole thing out of his mind and what to do. And there in Ashkelon, he slew 30 men of them. That's the Philistines. And he took their spoil. And he gave change of garments unto them, which expounded the riddle. And his anger was kindled. And he just left and went to his house. Where's his wife? He didn't finish the feast. He didn't consummate the marriage. He got mad and he left. The anger, I won't look at it now, but in chapter 15 and verse 3, there's a little hint that he had a guilty conscience over what he did here because he did it in anger. But he will not keep the vow of his marriage. In fact, verse 20 says, but Samson's wife was given to his companion, whom he had used as his friend. In other words, like his best man. Samson was a predestinated miracle and blessed child. He was a special and specifically chosen man that had a divine mission and purpose. His mission was divinely declared, and his life was to be divinely protected. He was raised by godly parents in a godly and extra dedicated manner as a Nazirite. He was also blessed and specially empowered by God. But it was that first step. He went down to Timnath, the wrong place. That was just the first step. He went down. And that's not just physically, I believe that's spiritually as well when he made that decision. That started his fall. His downfall continued. But it's strange and yet a blessing that God still used this faulty sinner to deliver Israel and teach us lessons of divine providence and mighty acts of faith, that God can and does use faulty people, sinners who fail. They're not perfect. Amazing. Samson, I can't remember how many times I read this. Samson is a man empowered by the Spirit, but not controlled by the Spirit. That seems like an impossible contradiction, but here it is in the Word of God. And probably, I won't put it on everybody, but I'm sure that with some of us, it's the same way. God has empowered us, but we don't let him control us. Watch out, Christian, be warned. Here is a man who could not or did not control his emotions. He didn't control his lust. He didn't control his anger. And he didn't control his feelings of revenge. They had a hold on him. Samson knew the truth, but he did not let it correct his behavior. We need to be aware that the same can happen to any Christian. That we can know the truth, but knowing the truth isn't any good if you're not living in the truth and walking in the truth. Samson put his desires first, and that's why he fell. We must put first the desires of the Lord, and if we do that, then we will succeed in our walk with him. I qualify that because a lot of times when you just say, then we will succeed, people fill in the blank behind that succeed in your imagination of what it means to succeed. But to succeed means to be faithful to God. God may never have you be successful in this world. I think Abraham was the successful, very rich man. Job was the same way. We can put out many people. Paul was successful. But there are a lot of people who are successful in walking with the Lord, but have never had the fame of any of those men. God used Samson's anger, but Samson did not profit in knowing that he was the chosen deliverer. The wife he pleased, which so pleased him, now became an abandoned wife that's given to another. They didn't consummate the marriage, and they didn't think he was coming back. So the father, Samson's wife, was given to his companion, one of those Philistines, whom he used as his friend. He did not finish the wedding vows. He did not consummate the marriage. And Samson is just setting himself up for the next fall. Did he have victory in here? Yes, he slew 30 Philistines. He agitated the people of Philistia. God's not done with him. He's going to do some great things, but remember, he's just beginning. But it's so strange to read Samson's story, and then until you think about what was the key verse of all of the book of Judges. Remember what the key verse is? Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Doesn't that fit Samson? He did that which was right in his own eyes. It doesn't take away from the fact that God still used him and he's a man of great faith. Any more than David, because he was a man after God's own heart, that people have a hard time, because there's times when you see David was an adulterer and a murderer. And yet he was a great man of God as well. I don't read of Samson confessing his sin until the end. But God greatly used this man to begin the deliverance of Israel. But yet we see possibly ourselves in Samson. Don't be so quick to condemn him when you read of the tales of Samson.